The Denver Broncos have officially whittled their roster down to 53 players, making a series of roster moves to get down there. Let's just go ahead and jump right into the moves that they made and who has made the team for the Denver Broncos. The Broncos, starting off with the wide receiver position, have elected to keep 5 players: Cortland Sutton, Josh Reynolds, Devon Vele, Troy Franklin, and Marvin Mims. Tim Patrick, no trade materialized for him. Same thing for Samaje Perine. So both of those guys have officially been released. I wish them both nothing but the best moving forward. Thank you guys so much for your service, especially you, Timmy P. I wish that things had worked out differently. Brandon Johnson, Jalen Virgil, Little Jordan Humphrey, David Sills, Philip Dorsett, and Michael Bandy all have been waived by the Denver Broncos. I feel like right now, Brandon Johnson and Little Jordan Humphrey, as well as possibly Bandy or Sills, have the best chance to return on the practice squad. I'm a little bit surprised that they elected to move on from Humphrey. I thought that they were going to keep 6 wide receivers, but they had to hold on to some players at a couple of other positions. So I feel like Little Jordan Humphrey, they can sneak him onto the practice squad and they can elevate him. And once he's out of elevations, they can just sign him back to the active roster later on in the year. Same thing for Brandon Johnson. So that's kind of where things stand right now at the wide receiver position for the Denver Broncos. Moving into the offensive line, the Broncos ultimately elected to keep 9 offensive linemen. You've got your 5 starters: Bowles, Powers, Wattenberg, Miners, and McGlinchey. You've got Matt Parrott, Alex Forsyth, Alex Palczewski, and kind of a surprise, Frank Crum ends up making the active roster. Starting off with Crum, because I know this one is going to be perplexing to some in Broncos country. He's very raw in pass protection, but his run blocking, you can tell that the dude is a mauler who plays with a physicality and nastiness to his game. I think that the Broncos really like the raw talent of Crum, and they had some competition to get him as an undrafted free agent. Their concern is that he would get claimed off waivers by another team. I think that the Broncos really are hoping that with a year on the bench, with offensive line coach Zach Strief, that Crum can harness his raw talent and get better as a pass protector, and he can develop into a solid swing player for the Denver Broncos, or maybe even a long-term replacement option for Garrett Bowles. Obviously, we've got a long way to go before that happens, but the Broncos, I think, really like the upside of Frank Crum and were worried about losing him. That's why he made the team. Matt Parrott, he's going to be the swing left tackle. Alex Palczewski, the swing right tackle. And then you've got Forsyth, who can play guard and center. I didn't really like what we saw from Forsyth at guard, so maybe Matt Parrott is a guy who could end up being your immediate swing guard for the Broncos. I saw Joey Richards on Twitter of Let's Talk Broncos talking about that, and I think that makes sense. The Broncos ultimately end up moving on from Calvin Throckmorton, Will Sherman, DeMontre Jacobs, Nick Gargiulo, the 7th-round pick, Sam Mustipher, and Oliver Jervis. I think that Throckmorton is almost a lock to come back on the practice squad, assuming, of course, that, well, actually, I believe he's a vested veteran, so he doesn't have to go through the waiver wire, I believe. So Throckmorton is somebody that I definitely anticipate to be back. DeMontre Jacobs as well. He's got to go through the wire. Nick Gargiulo, I think, will be back, and I think Will Sherman could also be back as well. Tight ends, the Denver Broncos elect to keep 4: Adam Troutman, Greg Dulcich, Lucas Kroll, and then you've got Nate Atkins, who's kind of going to be your hybrid fullback tight end now because Michael Burton has been released. Clearly, the Broncos feel confident in Nate Atkins. I'm surprised that they didn't keep Burton because of special teams purposes, but I do feel like maybe they could bring him back on the practice squad as well. He's a vested veteran, doesn't have to go through waivers. He can sign back on the practice squad basically immediately. So that's probably why they moved on from Burton and released him, basically so they could keep Atkins on the roster and not have to worry about losing him to another team. He played really well in the preseason. Again, he can have some work both at fullback and at tight end. You can play some H-back in there. the Broncos love Nate Atkins' versatility, and he can almost play like a Kyle Juszczyk type role. So I think that they are really excited about what's to come with him. I think the Broncos are going to ultimately look to maybe add to this tight end room via the waiver wire. I don't know if Lucas Kroll's spot is exactly safe right now. We'll see what happens. Thomas Yasmin, he is the Broncos' international pathway player. He'll be back on the practice squad as essentially a free player. Hunter Kampmoyer made some nice plays. I think he'll be somewhere in the NFL. I don't necessarily know if it's here in Denver. Moving into quarterbacks, no surprise. We're keeping all three quarterbacks. No surprise there at all. Running backs, Javonte Williams, Jaleel McLaughlin, Audric Estime, and Blake Watson. We already talked about why Watson made the team. It's kind of a similar situation as Frank Crum, where basically they were worried about him possibly getting claimed off of waivers. So Blake Watson is here because of that. Tyler Beatty has been waived, and then Samaje Perine has been released after no trade materialized with him. I think Beatty has a strong chance to be back on the practice squad. Moving into the defensive side of the ball, for defensive linemen, the Denver Broncos keep Zach Allen, DJ Jones, John Franklin Myers as your obvious starters, Malcolm Roach, Ioma Uwazurike, and then Jordan Jackson. Jordan Jackson had the pair of sacks in the preseason finale, looked really good throughout the course of camp. Congratulations to him, the former Air Force star, for making the team, and then they ultimately elect to keep Ioma Uwazurike and not expose him to waivers. I think that's a smart move. You weren't going to bring him back to the team and expose him to waiver wires. You're not going to do that. You weren't going to bring him back and not keep him. So, yeah, man, I think that Ioma Uwazurike definitely deserves this roster spot for sure. Edge rushers, the Broncos are going to keep four guys: Baron Browning, Nick Benito, Jonathan Cooper, and Jonah Ellis, Dondre Tillman, Thomas Incoom. I feel like both of those guys have strong chances to make the practice squad. And on the interior defensive line, I forgot to mention cuts: Matt Henningsen, Elijah Garcia, and Jordan Miller, and Angelo Blackson. All of those guys are gone. I think Henningsen, who's been a solid rotational defensive lineman for the Broncos over the last couple of years, he could be back, as well as possibly Elijah Garcia or Jordan Miller. I think all of those guys have a chance to be back on the practice squad for the Broncos. Edge rusher, you got your four guys that you're keeping. I think that right now it really feels like Incoom and Tillman both have strong chances to make the practice squad. Darrell Nachami, he was ultimately waived by the Broncos with an injury designation after suffering a hamstring injury in the preseason finale. He's going to ultimately revert to injured reserve if he's not claimed off waivers, which, spoiler alert, he will not be claimed off of waivers. So he's going to ultimately go on injured reserve there for the Denver Broncos. At off-ball linebacker, Cody Barton has won the starting job. No surprise there. And what is a little bit of a surprise to some is that Jonas Griffith was released as a vested veteran, does not have to go on the waiver wire. Griffith simply got usurped on the depth chart. Barton earned the starting role. Justin Sternad is the clear-cut backup. He played awesome in the preseason, and he's also a key special teams player. And then you had Lavelle Bailey, who made the roster as an undrafted free agent. So that's three undrafted free agents that made the active roster, with Bailey, Crum, and Blake Watson. They feel really strong about Bailey and Sternad, strong enough that Jonas Griffith was made expendable. There is a possibility that Griffith could be back on the practice squad, but I haven't heard many media members talk about it. Normally, they'll hint at who's going to be back on the practice squad, so I don't know if this is indeed the end for Jonas Griffith, but if it is with the Denver Broncos, then I wish him nothing but the best. And overall, man, I think that Lavelle Bailey has a very high ceiling. I am super duper excited about him. Moving into DBs, the Denver Broncos ultimately elect to keep Traymon Smith. He's going to be basically kind of a special teams player, your main gunner. The Broncos were never going to get rid of him. He brings too much value on special teams. Keidron Smith also made the roster after being a factor in 3 turnovers in each preseason game. So absolutely awesome stuff there for Keidron Smith. Happy for him to have made the team. Really, really excited about what he brings to the table. Pat Surtain, Levi Wallace, Riley Moss, Damari Mathis is going to go on short-term IR. And then at nickel, you've got Jaquan McMillan and Chris Abrams-Drain. At safety, PJ Locke, Brandon Jones, JL Skinner, Keidron Smith, and Devon Key have all made the active roster. The Broncos low-key have some really good depth there in that DB room. Guys that they move on from include Caleb Hayes, Omar Brown, Tanner McAllister, Art Green, Reese Taylor, Quentin Newsome. I think that Taylor, Newsome, McAllister all have really strong chances to make the practice squad, possibly Art Green as well. Finally, Trenton Gill, he was cut yesterday as the punter. Riley Dixon wins the punter job, so it's going to be Will Lutz, Riley Dixon, Mitchell Ferboni in your special teams unit. So there we go, Broncos country. That is the 53-man roster. This is all subject to change before we head into week 1. The Broncos could make some claims off the waiver wire. Some of these guys who initially made the 53 might not be on the 53 come week 1, but really happy for everybody who has made the initial 53, and for yet another year, the Denver Broncos have multiple undrafted free agents make the 53-man roster. The Broncos are one of the best in the NFL at finding undrafted free agents, and this is another awesome example of it. So let me know in the comment section below, Broncos country, what do you feel about the current state of this roster? Do you feel like the Broncos are going to make some moves on the waiver wire? And what cuts did surprise you for the Denver Broncos? Oh, and also Drew Sanders and Delarian Turner-Yell, they have been moved to the physically unable to perform list. They will be back at some point in the regular season. Darrell Nachami and Damari Mathis are on short-term injured reserve. Mathis suffering that high ankle sprain in the preseason finale. But let me know about your thoughts on this roster in the comment section below. And until next time, guys, I'm your host, Gage Madrid, saying peace out.